Hello? It's me. I'm here. I'm all alone today. You're here with me. We're friends, right? We're going to hang out. Um, I've got a bunch of stuff I want to talk about today, and it's all related to development tooling, Compose mostly, but I'm here for your questions. Sadly, Nirmal won't be here today. He's busy, but he'll be back. My co-host will be back. If you haven't met Nirmal, if this is maybe your first live stream, we've been friends ever since we both became Docker captains back in, oh my goodness, 2016 maybe? Can't remember exactly when, but he's been visiting with me on shows recently and hanging out, asking great questions of our guests, and we're going to have more of those. Next week, we're going to have you fizzy on the show. We're going to talk about preview environments, ephemeral environments, and how to set those up in GitHub Actions and just cool stuff like that. I think everybody should have that. I think we should all have automatically spun up environments for every epic or PR that we make that allows us to see a running version of our app with the changes we intend to make. I mean, I think that's just really something that everyone, every team, every app should have, assuming it's a web app or an app that runs on servers. Obviously, it's a little harder if you're making a mobile app. Like, you have to get it on a pretend device or something. So I don't really dabble a lot in mobile environment creation and virtualization for Android or iOS apps. So I'm not really sure how that all works. Maybe I'll have a guest on the show sometime that'll tell me how all that works. But I'm glad you're here. So I have some announcements. First, welcome. Hi, Medium. Hi, Martin. Thanks for being here. Martin is one of the old faithfuls that's been around quite some time. A pretty good regular. I'm impressed with the commitment. I appreciate you. If y'all didn't know, DockerCon is coming up. I'm going to be there. I don't yet know what I'm talking about. We're all anxiously awaiting Docker to tell us who won the RFP raffle and who's going to speak and what we're going to speak on. I submitted multiple ideas, so I don't actually know what, if anything, I'm going to be talking about. In case you didn't know, DockerCon is going to be in LA this year at the beginning of October, a month before KubeCon. So we're going to have a month of container conferences, essentially, where I'm going to be preparing next month for DockerCon, then preparing after DockerCon for KubeCon. KubeCon's in Chicago in North America this year. And I have a coupon if you're wanting to go to LA to DockerCon. It's kind of going back to its roots. It's going to be this small event, not the 5,000 to 7,000 person event that it was in its heyday in maybe 2018, 2019, when it was in EU and North America. We don't actually know if they're going to have a European one. Right now, they're just focused on this one. But I have a coupon. And let me get that on screen. Let me put that. Let's see, DockerCon coupon. So this is if you're going to go to LA. Now, if you want to watch virtually, it's free. But if you want to join us in LA, and that would be awesome. A lot of my Docker friends are going to be there. A lot of the Docker captains are going to be there. We're going to have essentially what's like a Docker captain reunion where everybody's coming together. Docker's helping to make sure we're all there. And I have this coupon. I'm actually having to look up how much the coupon is for. Let's see. I haven't sent this coupon out. It's a $300 discount. So if you're going as an individual, the early bird is until the end of the month. So that's $300 off that price. And the price goes up by $300 after the end of this month. So the Docker Lover 300 coupon will get you there a little bit cheaper. And if you can't make it, if your company can't pay for you, you can't make it, or whatever the reason is, you can always do the virtual for free. This is a little bit different than KubeCon, because KubeCon, you don't get virtual for free, but it's not that much money, right? It's way less than a physical price. The KubeCon price is, it's different than that, but it's different for a person versus a corporation or an employee. And it is a technically longer event now. So they've included there's all these pre-events at KubeCon that are now a single price instead of what it used to be at KubeCon, every single pre-event on day zero, we sometimes call it. Day zero events were individually priced, and that was tough because often I would want to go to both, 2 or 3, and I didn't want to have to pay for all of them. And last year at KubeCon, I went to the GitOps days, which I loved. That was fantastic. If you've been around here, you've seen me talking about GitOps, and it was great to have a whole day focused on that. The best combo is back, Nuno and myself. Yeah, welcome, Nuno. Let's get into it. So, you know about DockerCon, you know about the coupon. I just released a new newsletter yesterday. You know about my newsletter, right? If not, you do now. So it's over at bret.news. Put that link in there. If there's one thing from me that I recommend to you, is my free newsletter, because it's a weekly summary of things I've created, people that are on the show, what's on the live stream, what's on the podcast, any new GitHub repos I've made, any major course updates I've made, and then usually a single thing that I'd like to talk about. It's not a terribly long email, but it does focus on content in my world. It's not a news summary. It's not something where there's a whole bunch of links to other things happening. There's lots of people in the DevOps space that already make those kind of newsletters. So luckily, I do a lot of stuff. And so I have always something to talk about. In fact, I have a long list of things I already want to talk about in these newsletters. So recent newsletters have talked about GitHub Copilot Labs and the new GitHub Copilot chat that I'm absolutely, completely enjoying. It's essentially ChatGPT built into VS Code. And that's exactly how I really want my chat experience to be. I open up VS Code. It remembers where I left off. It's kind of fantastic. I have a whole email about that. That was a couple of weeks ago on the newsletter. And of course, I show off who's going to be on the live stream, and if we released a podcast that week, who was on the podcast. And so I talked to you a little bit about GitHub Copilot Chat and how I built a Go program from scratch without ever having created a Go program from scratch. I have been reading Go for many years, maybe close to a decade. I think my first experience was Docker itself. And then, of course, all the Kubernetes tools came out in Go, and now the cloud native ecosystem tends to default to Go in a lot of programs. So I've certainly read a lot of it because I've wanted to understand what things were doing. I have programmed for 20 years in various languages, but I like to tell people rarely pay me to program. I rarely get paid for my programming skills because they're not awesome. Yours are probably awesome. I'm more of the guy in the middle, the DevOps. I came from ops. So our original programming way back in the day was really mostly shell and batch scripts back in the the DOS days, not Docker days, the DOS days, the Windows days. And I cut my teeth on the internet with HTML and ASP, classic ASP, not ASP.NET, but classic ASP, then PHP, then Cold Fusion. So I've never been paid as a full-time programmer in a dev team. I have been paid on occasion to write a little bit of code, but it's rare. Node.js, I was paid for a while to do that. It was actually a company that I paid myself. And then before that, there was some Cold Fusion and PHP days 20 years ago. So I consider myself a novice in Go in terms of being able to write from scratch. If I was going to write something, I was going to have to spend a lot of time on Stack Overflow, a lot of time on the Go website with the excellent documentation. They even have a programming utility built in, so you can write code there and it'll tell you whether it works. And so I didn't have a lot of familiarity with a lot of the structure of Go. I understood Go commands. I understood how Go is built, because that's really where the land of DevOps starts, is when the developer makes the commit and they need to build their app and they need to test their app. So if you're getting into DevOps engineering, you're probably going to be more involved with the automation, the tooling side of it, the build and test. And so I was definitely familiar with all that. So I wanted to be clear, I wasn't literally day one programmer. But this little experiment I did a couple weeks ago was to write a program from scratch in a day. I did it in half a day. It's a couple hundred lines of code, not that big, but it does image manipulation. It imports CSVs into arrays. It has inputs and outputs. So it wasn't just something super simple. It actually did a real thing. And I wanted to, for a while now, find a project in a language I wasn't super familiar with that I couldn't just start writing in VS Code without having to go search the internet. And that's exactly what I did. I could have picked something else. I could have picked Rust. I could have picked some other language that I was not as familiar with in Go rather than Go. But I thought this was a good example of maybe someone who's a junior programmer or someone who's a programmer in one language and wants to start learning another one. And could I learn stuff pretty easily without having to take a course, which I've actually bought Go courses and not taken them. You know, that's a thing. So that was a fun experiment. Anyway, go back and read that newsletter, Bret.news. And if you go back, this is the year that I rebooted my newsletter for, I think, the 4th time in 20 years. So we started over after Twitter shut down Review, which was my past newsletter, and I didn't even let me easily export and import all of my content. So I essentially had to start over. This time I've learned my lesson, and now my newsletter is on my website. It is my blog engine, Ghost. It is open source. No one can take it from me. No one can shut down my newsletter service. I'm very grateful because I've learned that lesson the hard way multiple times, that if you use a proprietary closed source newsletter service, your newsletter may not exist one day. And so I'm here on the Ghost engine. And this week I talked about Compose's new feature called Includes. So we're going to get into that. And I don't really have demos, but I'm happy to work through some things based on your questions. So the reason I'm here is to talk to you and answer your questions, hopefully. So a recent conversation in our high fivers. Did you know about the high fivers? So if you go up on membership on my website, if you sign up for the high fivers, you can also do this on Patreon. You can do it right here in YouTube. You can sign up for the high fivers and you get to hang out once a month in Discord with DevOps professionals. And there's not that many of us that join every month. We've a small subset of the people that are in the high fivers membership. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. A small number of those show up in our Discord server for a video chat. And it's kind of like a lunch and learn or just a lunch hangout. And we don't always talk pure DevOps. We maybe get on tangents. We have been doing this for years now, so some of us actually feel like we know each other. We've actually met at conferences because of this. So I'm very happy to have made new friends as a part of this group. And if you're interested in that, it's basically $6 American a month to get in. You get exclusive benefits as in terms of Discord channels, and those are over here. Did you know about a Discord server? Did I mention our Discord server? So we have a Discord server. We just recently hit 15,000 people, and it is all about DevOps. It's all about cloud native computing in the world of DevOps and containers. And there's conversations happening every day that I can't keep up with. As you can see, I checked everything last night, and there's more conversations back today. So stuff's going on there. We actually have an event list, so you can go and see what's happening, including these live streams, including Swarm Fans, a new monthly meetup, or actually it's bi-monthly, but that's free in case you're a Swarm fan. You can come hang out with others using Swarm in production and maybe learning Swarm, or they're maybe just been using Swarm for years, and other stuff, including the high fivers events. Those are all in there. So come hang out with us, wouldn't you? I think it's now my social network. Now that we've had Twitter kind of happen into X and all these things happen, we have Threads now, I have Blue Sky, I have Mastodon, I have all these different places with all my friends spread out. And then for me, it's really just forced me to go here where it's just the community of things I want to talk about. It's a safe space. We try to keep it safe. We keep the spammers out. That's right. I can see you in the chat. It is really live. This is not recorded. But you can get there through membership. You can subscribe to this YouTube channel. If you prefer Patreon, use that. If you prefer checking out my website, use it there. We don't have Discord memberships yet, but that's probably coming. And we're talking in there yesterday on the High Fivers monthly meetup. We were talking about dev containers versus Compose Sync. So I thought that was an interesting comparison, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I have thoughts. If you know what dev containers is, it's a new standard, or I'd call it a standard, containers.dev. And it allows your editor, your IDE, whether that's Vim or VS Code or full-on Visual Studio or IntelliJ or whatever your editor of choice is, these all now are starting to support various features inside of a dev container. The idea is that you can develop in containers with a tool that will automatically set up everything you need in the container, not just build a Docker file, because sometimes you need more than that. And it doesn't always have to be local. It could be a remote container. So dev containers is pretty slick. And then it comes along Compose, which of course is my favorite tool. It's been around forever. And Compose comes up with something called Sync or Watch. I like Sync. I think that's a better, cooler name, but the name is called, I think, Compose Watch. It's just a feature in Compose that allows it to watch files on your host, not in the container, but on your host, and copy them into the container or rebuild the container image and then recreate the container based on changes to the host. So I look at Compose Sync as something that helps me avoid dev containers in a lot of places where maybe I want to develop on the host, but I want it to run in a container. And maybe I'm using NVim and I don't have everything set up for a dev container in NVim, which I've never actually done. So I don't know how that works. But let's say I'm in Vim and I'm just editing on the host and I just want it to be running in container. If I change a file on the host, copy it in, restart the container or rebuild the image, however I want it to work. That's what Compose Watch is. And dev containers to me is all about making my editor use the container as my dev environment with all the tooling and all the hooks into my editor that I need. And I don't have to have any tooling on my host. And I can use this transparently. I can use this transparently where I don't even know that I'm in a container sometimes. And these feel like two opposing features. So we talked recently, yesterday, actually this week, about the comparing and contrasting of those tools and how you might even use them together, where you might have Compose running other services, like maybe an Nginx proxy that is using config files on your host, copying them into the container, and restarting the container like Nginx when that file changes. And that could be a dependency service that is not the one you're developing on. So we can talk about that. I can show off demos. We can dig into a sample project. But let's go to the chat. Yeah, Nuno's talking about, the expense of travel is no joke. And that's one of the reasons it's hard for me to go to European conferences unless they cover my cost, because it's a lot. Yeah, coming across the ocean. Never mind the fact that most of these are in big cities, and those big cities are usually quite expensive in terms of hotels. I mean, I've gotten to the point now where it's $300 a night in a lot of these cities, San Francisco, LA, etc. So yes, it can be very expensive. Yes, Normal's not making it this week. False advertising. He was on the graphic. he was going to be here, but then things came up. So he will be back next week, and we will cover all the fun stuff. So it's just me this week. We're going to talk about whatever you want to talk about. Yeah, Lee's talking about just starting to use dev containers. Yeah, I learned about dev containers because I think it was first in VS Code. And then it became... do I have it up? So it has its own website to talk about the spec. And then different tools implement the spec. So if we look at the tool list, I think VS Code was first. Let's just assume VS Code was first. But there's other ones listed. I think there's actually, I'm going to guess, a bigger list than this, but I don't know for sure. because I don't use a lot of other editors. It feels like something that NVim or Vim would also support somehow. I'm just going to Google NVim dev container. Yeah, so it at least exists for you shell editors out there. So it might be possible if you're a Vim fan. Yep. Nuno's talking about DevPod. So we had DevPod on the show. We were actually the announcing show. It was a special release live show. So if you want to learn about DevPod, which is a little bit different than Dev Container specifically, but what it does is it helps you manage the creation, the pausing, and the deletion of machines, local or remote, to run your code in. So if you're not using a local container runtime like Docker, maybe you want to do something else, you can use the cloud. You can use a Kubernetes server, either locally or remote. You can use a single VM in the cloud. And the cool thing is this is to me like what Docker Machine could have been. Docker Machine was a tool that's no longer supported by Docker, but it created cloud instances as well as other things, and it would create VMs essentially and customize them and put Docker already on them and basically make them available for Docker to run on. DevPod takes it one step further. They even do some slick stuff around when you stop using a VM in the cloud, it will save it, stop it, probably, I guess, delete it, but maybe save the disk so that you're not charged when you're not using it. Think of this as code spaces on your own infrastructure. So it's pretty slick. If you want to check out that show, you can go back in time. I just go to Bret.live and scroll back in the live streams. There we go. The DevPods. So if you're curious about DevPods, check that out on my channel. We had Lucas and Rich on. That was a lot of fun. Did that a couple of months ago. And that solves the problem of what if I can't develop locally, or I'd like my development environment set up differently than just a Docker container in Docker Desktop. It's also got a nice GUI. I like that they include a GUI. That's actually a fun addition. This could have just been a CLI tool, you know, but the fact that I can actually give it credentials for my different cloud environments, it'll save them, and then I can create servers with that connection to that different, you know, whether it's AWS or GCP or whatever. And it's got a lot of options. I imagine that they've added more since, but they have a lot of providers there. Let's see if they have a list somewhere of the current ones. But, you know, it's not just the major cloud vendors, like the big three. It's more than that. So I like DigitalOcean. It's cheaper. I have credits. And so, let's see. Yeah. So, yeah, Google Cloud, Azure, DigitalOcean. I feel like we should have more. There's some other cheaper alternatives as well than especially compared to, you know, Azure or AWS. And it can even just use SSH, so you can spin up something on your own. You know, I have a server in my closet. It runs Hyper-V, and I could spin up an Ubuntu machine there. I could SSH in, and then I get the GUI. And the GUI would allow me to manage my workspaces and manage my credentials, and allow, you know, and then I could open up my editor, connect right to it. So it's also using the dev container spec. So it is, that's why that's such a great recommendation from Nuno. Thank you for reminding me about that. But that's sort of the, it intersects with the dev container JSON so that you can use it with a editor that supports dev container. And I think VS Code even creates a template. There's also a CLI. You can get a dev container CLI that it talks about in here. And a lot of projects that I work with, they already have a dev container JSON in the .vs Code directory. So, or is it in the VS Code directory, or it probably goes in a different directory. I'm not sure if I can go in root or not. So, let's talk about Compose for a minute. So, in my newsletter this week, let's go back to the newsletter real quick. So, in the newsletter this week, I talk about Compose includes. So, you know my affinity for Compose. I still think it's the best tool for local development in terms of using containers or maybe even developing in containers. It can be used with dev container to do various things. These are not either or tools. I do like Compose mostly because I've been using it longer than dev containers. But I do like, even if I'm not developing inside the container, which I don't always do, I like to have all my dependencies running in containers for ease of use, right? And I'd rather have Compose set those up. I'd rather it automatically set my database password, automatically seed my database for my application, set up my front-end proxy with TLS. I even have a bunch of examples over on GitHub for that. So let's see. Yep. Compose dev TLS. Had to remember the name of that repo. So I have this repo that uses traffic and a wildcard cert that there's multiple levels to this, by the way. Like this setup is pretty common for web developers. They want to be able to use TLS locally so that their app behaves as they would expect, like it would in production. And often we're running front-end apps on something like an Nginx or just a simple web server, and then we've got a backend API that the front end calls, right? And so a lot of these, it's easier to make it work if you have TLS, and TLS is trusted by the browser. So this is a simple little example. It's not a separate tool. It does have a shell script, but that shell script is really just to create a local certificate with the name rather that you care about. So you can create multiples. I've created a convention here where my certs go in a specific directory inside my user directory on my machine. And for each DNS name I want to use in a certificate, I can use that quick little bash script to create that certificate. Then I add it to my browser as a trusted certificate. I have to do that manually. You can also just skip it and use the warning. But I like to add it to my browser. And so that's why I end up using the same certificate. And I set it up as a wildcard certificate so that I can have subdomains. So it might be, api.bret.lol. And then I might have web.api.lol. Web.bret. Yep. And then these things are all coming through traffic. And traffic is what hosts the TLS endpoint so that my apps on the back end that I'm running don't have to have any certificates in them. And generally in containers, that's what you want to do. You don't want to stuff certificates for user and client connections directly into your app containers. You usually want some sort of front-end proxy that's managing all that. If you're in Kubernetes, you usually have Certificate Manager or some other tool storing the certificates, as well as needing a proxy to listen on TLS ports for that connection, provide the certificate for encryption, and then pass the communications to a back-end web service. So that's a pretty typical setup, and this replicates that design very simply on a local Compose. So you don't have to have Kubernetes to do this. You don't need a complex setup. It's a simple Compose file example. And I've had this for years. I haven't got a lot of feedback on it, but I did get one PR where someone, thank you, Zerg, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, suggested that I set it up so that you can use Let's Encrypt, which is a great idea because Let's Encrypt would skip the step of me needing to import the certificate into my browser or to accept the certificate in my browser. And so this is a great addition. It does have its own requirements, and it does require extra steps. You obviously have to own your own domain. If you don't own your own domain, there are multiple ways you can use DNS. There is many common, what we're calling wildcard DNSs out there. I own my own, which you're free to use, called Bret.lol. So essentially, the Bret.lol domain, all of its subdomains, will resolve to the localhost IP. So you can use that, and then you can use alternatives. I actually think one of these went away. I'm trying to think. I think VCAP might have actually stopped working. I can't remember. But in Chrome, you can use localhost, but that doesn't work in all browsers. It doesn't work in all use cases. So I tend to use one of the other ones. XIP is a common one. And then I just bought my own and set it up for Bret.lol. So when I'm developing locally, if I'm working on a web service and I'm trying to design my setup, I will often use this repo to start off with. I already have the Bret.lol wildcard certificate. It's already trusted on my machine. I don't need to recreate it for every project. It doesn't even live in my projects. It lives in its own directory on my machine in my user repo. I'm sorry, in my user directory. I just have a subdirectory called certs, and I store all these in there. And sometimes, every once in a while, I work on a project where they want a very specific domain name. Essentially, they kind of hard code it, or they have some sort of expectation on the domain name. And so I will have to create a new wildcard cert just for that project. Maybe it's a legacy project that's not container ready yet, and I have to adhere to their naming standards for the time being. So I will sometimes create those. So yeah, check that out. But that's how I can use that with Compose. And then we now have multiple ways, now 3 official ways, to combine Compose files together for more complex projects and for overrides and templating and merging all of the different settings in YAML. And if we have time today, I thought I would go through some of those examples. You may have already dealt with this, where you're dealing with multiple Compose files. Maybe you've put a Compose file in every app, in every repo, and maybe you get tired of that and you'd rather just have them in one place. Maybe you want to avoid duplication of YAML and you'd rather have one Compose file depend on others. Or maybe, what is my favorite use case, is that you have a generic-ish Compose file in the repo, and then you have an override file that sits on your machine that overrides the project settings for your local development. Maybe it needs to add in some tokens or secrets that you keep in an env file. Maybe you want to use different ports, and so you want to hard code the ports. Maybe you want different bind mounts or volumes for that particular setup rather than what's already in the repo. You can do all that with these 3 different ways for Compose. So we can talk about that today. Let's see what's in chat. John's asking about getting started with Docker. Well, that's why I'm here. So look below. There's a link to my courses, including what I believe is the world's most popular course for learning Docker, Docker Mastery. There's a link down there to get a coupon, and you can get it really cheap, considering it's now 21 hours of video and growing. And it teaches you from the beginning Docker, then Compose, which I'm talking about today, how to build it, containers, how to run containers. It is maintained. So it's actually a course that's been around for 7 years, but every year I update it. And right now I'm actually going through updating and adding new sections. And I just finished some Kubernetes updates to that course. So eventually you'll learn Kubernetes, but you need to understand the fundamentals of containers first. So you can get that course on Udemy. And the coupons are below. Good luck with that. There's over 300,000 people that have bought that course. So I'd love to have you. And then you get a community with that. You can join our community over on Discord. You can actually sign up for that for free. You don't have to buy the course to do that. So that's over at, I'm going to put the link in chat, devops.fan. That's our Discord server. That's where the chat people hang out. Or you can go to discord.gg/devops. Yeah, Rezi's asking the same question. Yeah, my Docker Mastery course is not designed if you're new to tech. It assumes, and you will see on the homepage, it assumes and requires that you know things, that you know some stuff about the cloud, that you are not new to Linux, that you know how a shell works and you know how shell commands. So if you're brand new to tech, it doesn't teach you everything in tech. It's meant for someone who is new to containers, but already knows some server stuff, some developer concepts like how do I build an app in some language, or how do I install apps in some language? How do you create servers in the cloud? Some of those basics. How do computers talk to each other over TCP and UDP and the different IP protocols? You need to understand a lot of those fundamentals, because this isn't a networking course. This isn't a Linux server course, and containers mostly run on Linux. Some of them can run on Windows, but this is a server technology. So those courses are meant for you and to be a new person in containers, and you start from scratch with the fundamentals and the concepts, and then you start learning how to run them, how to make them, and then how they talk and how to make them talk to each other, how they work on networks, and then you will learn about security, and then you learn about compose. You learn all kinds of stuff, data, storing data, that kind of thing. So there's a lot in there. We're over 170 videos in that course now. So there's a lot. You don't have to finish it all. It's one of those things where you learn until you don't need to learn anymore. And then you come back to it later, because you'll have always access to it. And it gets updated quite frequently. I don't go more than a couple of months without changing something in that course, because something's always changing, or I'm always tweaking something to improve it. James is asking about learning in the cloud. Does it really matter which cloud you choose? Not really. So the concepts of all of the clouds are the same. You have machines. You can create machines, servers in the cloud, and then you have to deal with networking. You have to deal with storage. You have to deal with firewalls. You have to deal with databases. They all operate differently, and they all name things differently. But I recommend you stick with one. If you're learning and you don't know which one you need to learn, because maybe you're not in a company that you want to be in, so you don't know which one they use. Because if you're in a company already and you're trying to get a new job in DevOps or something, or you're trying to learn the cloud, learn the one that your company already uses. Or learn the one that you want in your job. If you're looking for jobs that specifically are going to need AWS skills, then definitely learn AWS. AWS is the largest of the clouds, so if you didn't have a choice, learning Amazon is most likely going to be the one that all the companies are hiring for, because it's the largest. Doesn't mean it's the best, doesn't mean it's the right fit for everyone, but if you don't have another way to pick, just pick AWS. I would say a general DevOps or cloud engineer, it is assumed generally in tech that you know how AWS works at a fundamental level. There are way too many services for me to even know. But the core fundamentals that they started with 15 years ago, like EC2 and networks and firewalls and proxies, storage, that kind of stuff, those are all the low-level fundamentals. So learn that on AWS if you don't have any other reason to learn something else. If you work at a company that's a Microsoft company and they are in Azure, then you should be definitely learning Azure first. But if you're just shooting in the dark, pick AWS and learn it enough that you can set up websites, you can administrate servers, you can manage firewalls, you can run backups and restore data, that you know how databases work and you can create databases. Maybe you just install a Drupal or a WordPress system inside of an EC2 instance, which is a server, and then you connect that to an RDS database, which is RDS is the name of the database technologies, some of them at least in AWS. So you get the idea that you just want to start a low level, run some stuff in it. There's sample projects all over the internet. And, if you're looking for sample projects, go look them up on GitHub. So go to github.com and search for example AWS cloud or demo apps AWS. And you'll probably find a whole bunch of stuff that you can learn about, you can try on. And then, of course, if you're a student, go try looking for the free AWS instances or the free accounts. You don't have to be a student, but sometimes there are student-specific programs for people that are still in university. I know GitHub has one of those where you can get a whole lot of stuff from GitHub and other partners for free. So hopefully that helps. What is presently a good way to share the certificate file with multiple traffic instances running on the manager nodes of a Docker swarm? That's a good question, Stan. So Traffic, the open source version, will automatically go get a Let's Encrypt certificate, for example, but it will store it in that instance of Traffic. If you want multiple instances of Traffic, you either have to manually store the certificates in secrets, so you can put the certificate in a secret in Swarm, and then mount that secret into a container and tell Traffic to use that certificate. That means you're manually managing the certificate, you're manually updating it in a secret, and then Traffic, the multiple traffics, can look at that same secret, which is mounted on the file system. So you can do that. That's probably the easiest way to get started. If you pay for Traffic, I believe it comes with its own mechanism for keeping that certificate centralized. Don't quote me for that. That may only be in Kubernetes. I'm trying to think of the current Traffic 2.x way for centralized certificate management in Docker Swarm. It's not top of my head. There might be someone in chat that actually knows better than me. But if it was me, I was manually using a certificate. If it's a small cluster, personally, I only run one Traffic instance. If I have to run it in cluster, I run one instance. If it crashes, it will be recreated by the Swarm orchestrator, and it's a single point of failure, but it gets recovered quickly if there's problems. And if I need to, I maybe put that Swarm Traffic instance on not a manager node. I might put it on its own dedicated node so it has plenty of resources and can handle the incoming traffic. As you grow up, you'll probably want your proxies to be external. If you're in the cloud, you almost always have your proxies, your load balancers. Those are almost always external. You're using the cloud versions. And so you probably won't even need Traffic to support TLS because you're probably doing that on the cloud itself. And then if you have Traffic in cluster, you can have multiple Traffic containers that don't have to worry about TLS. So hopefully that helps. And if anyone else has a better recommendation for Stan in chat, let me know. All right, got a question. Is it possible to link a Swarm to Docker Desktop using the WSL instance on Windows that helps run Docker Desktop? Been thinking to use the WSL as kind of a command center of sorts. I think I want to get into Compose to containerize Python applications. So I'll answer the first question here. So I generally don't do that. First off, I don't really... let me back up. Docker Desktop is for development only. You don't run servers on Docker Desktop. You don't on a Windows desktop machine, Windows 10, Windows 11. You generally don't want to run server containers in WSL. That's not really the purpose. These are all things that are meant for local use. They probably will have, non-public IPs on your physical network. There'll probably be firewall rules that'll protect them because that's usually what you want for local development tooling. And I don't normally run multiple Swarm nodes unless I want to do a specific kind of learning where I want to experiment with multiple node setups and maybe pinning containers to various nodes. The thing about Swarm and Kubernetes is you can do everything in terms of learning the tools, practicing the tools, developing on those tools. You can do all of that with single nodes right in Docker Desktop without making a second or third node. There's nothing really gained other than some of the esoteric functionality around node management and swapping out one node for another and learning how that works and how do you drain a node and then replace a node. Those are more orchestration management things, and it's hard to replicate all that locally, so I tend to just do that with cloud instances. Can you connect other stuff to WSL locally? It's probably possible. In fact, Nuno, if he's still here, has a WSL dev blog that maybe even talks about that. So, for example, this little setup here talks about making a leader and doing other things. So I will put this in chat. Thanks for that, Nuno. So you might check that out and see if that can help you get to where you want to go. I mean, really though, I so rarely do it. I do it in the course to show people how they can use multipass, but I don't use WSL. Just because I tend to like to, if I'm using Kubernetes or Swarm for learning and I'm learning multi-node stuff, I tend to want that to be separate than my dev setup and my dev Kubernetes, my dev Docker that are just a single instance and they're working in Docker Desktop. And Docker Desktop doesn't support built-in multi-node, right? So it's usually a little tricky, hence the length of this blog post. It's usually a little tricky to get instances running in some other virtualization tool like Hyper-V or VirtualBox to communicate with Docker Desktop. Docker Desktop's not even really running on a full Linux operating system as you would think of as a full Linux server. It's a very minimal Linux setup that is just for running Docker containers. It's a special little Linux tiny VM. And so when I'm experimenting with server management and cluster management, I usually want a full Ubuntu, for example. I usually want that full OS. And that's why I tend to use multipass, because multipass is one of the quickest ways to get a full VM running Ubuntu, starts up in seconds. It doesn't require me to manually install Linux and choose which keyboard layout and which time zone I'm in and all the things that when you set up, an ISO of a Linux server. Multipass allows me to do that pretty quickly out of the box. So that's just me. Doesn't mean there's not other ways to do it. Doesn't mean that the way you want to do it is not right for you. It probably is, like if that's what you think you need. So hopefully that helps. On to your next question. I think I want to get into Compose to containerize Python applications. Any advice on how that process would work practically? Well, there's nothing inherently special about Python and putting it in a container. There's tons of examples out there for putting Python in a container. You can do it in 10 lines of Docker file or less. So absolutely. And you can use dev containers like we talked about earlier. Dev container setups work great with Python. And the nice thing is you can specify your Python version inside your Docker file, and then if you need specific development extensions with pip, right, you can put all that stuff in your compose file, your Docker file, and have your Docker file build up your exact image. And you can use dev container JSON file that we talked about earlier. You can use that to enhance your development environment. And then you can use compose because your Python is probably going to need some sort of database or backend something. It's maybe not just that single Python app. So your Docker Compose makes it simple to spin this up and down. It's a single command to spin up. It's a single command to spin down. It has lots of great utility commands. And so, yeah, I always use Compose. I don't, unless I'm just showing an example or doing something one-off, I almost never use Docker Run on my local machine. I'm always, for local development, for local DevOps type of tasking or development tasking, I'm always using compose commands. Docker compose up, Docker compose down. And so all of my projects tend to have a compose file in them because that's the easiest way for me to inject environment variables, for me to set up the volumes if I need them, for any dependent services. And compose is super flexible and has lots of extra stuff. The reality is compose doesn't do anything that Docker can't do on its own. Compose is really just an alternative CLI for Docker. But it's way more dev friendly. It's way more human friendly on your local machine than a standard Docker command is. Docker commands are really raw, right? If you were to replace Docker Compose up with a Docker command, you would have a whole lot of options, and you'd probably have to create networks and then volumes and then a bunch of containers, and you might end up with 10 or 15 different Docker commands to do the same thing you do with one command in Docker Compose. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to use that. And my course, the Docker Mastery course, teaches you Docker Compose, and that my newsletter talks a lot. Get on my newsletter and you'll learn stuff about Docker Compose as the new features are released, which is how we started this conversation. Shortest and reliable path to become cloud native DevOps. Well, that path really depends on your background and current experience level. I don't have a course for every part of cloud native, right? And the word DevOps means lots of different things. So I'm sorry to tell you, but there is a mess in the world of naming jobs DevOps, because that might mean you're a build engineer and that you just focus on the building and testing of the apps. You don't actually develop the apps. DevOps might mean that you're a developer that's writing the apps, but you have to now care about that building and testing. It also might mean that you're more on the ops side and that you only manage Kubernetes clusters, and you might have a DevOps title to do that. So there are lots of different jobs inside the world of DevOps. There are plenty of people with a DevOps title that don't have to write much code or at all. And there are some people with DevOps in their title that do nothing but write code. The DevOps word is very generic. So if you're talking about a job in the world of cloud native DevOps, let's get specific. Tell me about your experience level. What have you done already? And then exactly what job roles you want to be doing. Are you wanting to be an automation expert? Are you wanting to be a build automation expert, or just general CI/CD? Do you know what that term means? Are you going to be on the ops side? Are you going to be on the dev side? Where do you land? Are you someone who's going to focus on Kubernetes operations and just managing Kubernetes clusters? Or are you someone who's going to spend all your time in AWS managing the cloud, and that you don't even really get into CI/CD automation? You're just provisioning resources in clouds. That might also be labeled a DevOps engineer. The title is very, very generic. It's basically as generic as developer, which tells you nothing, right? It tells you that you might run software. You might write software, but who knows what language that might be, what frameworks, and what part of the ecosystem you might run in. So give me some more specifics and maybe I can help. There are DevOps roadmaps. And you might look at roadmap.sh. So that's a resource. There's lots of resources out there that will help get you started, but there is definitely not one path. There's not even one kind of job in DevOps. It's dozens and dozens of different types of jobs in DevOps. Hey, Dan, I'm not sure if I saw your question. All I see is that you said, I mean Docker images. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. If you were asking me a question, please ask again. Or maybe you're just answering someone else's question. I'm not sure. Thanks, Bennett. Good luck in the course. Getting 50% way through the course makes you in the top 10% of learners on that course, because a lot of people don't get that far into the course, or they hop around. So there's lots of stuff going on there, and yeah, good luck. I'm glad it's helping. Anton's asking about compose in production. So you can use compose in production, correct? I don't advocate for its use in production because it only knows about one server. It's not running as a service. So it's not running in the background. Compose isn't. It's just Docker running in the background. So it doesn't do a lot of the things that an orchestrator does. It won't automatically replace the container with an update when the image updates. It won't run health checks and restart the service if the service doesn't pass health checks. These are all things that Swarm and Kubernetes do. So I have an article. Now let's see. Let's see what I call this. I call this compose or swarm, maybe? Yes, I guessed correctly. So here's an article or a Q&A, Anton. And if you've asked this question before, this is not a new question and answer, but if you've asked it before, this answer has been around for 5+ years now. And I'm basically saying, here's all the reasons why a single node swarm is better than Docker Compose. That hasn't changed. Compose's scope has not changed. You can use Compose on a server just fine, as long as you understand its limits and how Swarm and Kubernetes are better, what they have out of the box that is more full-featured than Compose. Some people are perfectly fine running Compose on a single server. I tend to prefer, in some cases, Swarm. And I give a bunch of reasons here. So check out that link. And I think all that is still true. Nothing's really changed. Compose keeps getting more features, but those features aren't necessarily production features because the scope of Compose is as a development tool. And every once in a while, the Docker team dabbles in Compose having things like pushing to cloud infrastructure, but they've now deprecated that. So it continues to focus on local dev workflows. Like all the new features this year, the watch feature as well as the new includes feature, those are really more about local development and not necessarily applicable to servers in production. So the Compose team doesn't officially say this is a dev-only tool, but if you look at it and you see what features it has and the intention of those features, you can sort of derive from that it's not trying to solve production problems. We can all use Unix and Linux tools in lots of ways. It doesn't mean it's bad to use it on a server. It's just not going to have everything you need, probably. But I know plenty of people that have told me over the years that in their very simple little home lab or their personal website or whatever, that Compose works just fine for them, and that's great. It definitely is simpler to run, simpler than a single node Swarm server. Just because you kind of have to write the Compose files different nowadays because Swarm isn't as up to date on the Compose file format. So you might have to have two files, one for Swarm, one for local Compose use. And, if you're going to use Swarm, you probably want Healthchecks, which is an extra step. It's a good step. I always recommend Healthchecks. But you don't really get to take advantage of those in Compose. A lot of people don't use them. I actually use them in Compose, by the way, the Healthchecks, because I like the depends on feature. And for a long time now, I've been on this shouting from the rooftops with my sign that says, use depends on to start your things up in order. So when you have a big project and you have lots of different pieces, you can use Compose with Healthchecks, and it will even wait on that database to be available, and even wait on it based on how you set it up. It can wait on the database to be seeded before it starts up your development app. And most apps are flexible, so they will just crash and restart if they don't see the database or if they don't see the results in the database query. A lot of apps will just dynamically restart, right? So it's not a huge deal, but it's not a huge deal if you don't have Healthchecks. But if you look at a lot of my examples over the years, I will have depends on Compose files, and that's because I want my services to all start in order. And I want to have implied dependencies. So in a microservice architecture, you're going to have lots of different services, and those services will have sometimes a few, shouldn't be all the other services, but a few other services that it needs in order to be useful in a development environment. So you can use depends on to create that matrix of dependencies so that when you start up that microservice that is the payment API or the login API or something like that, that it has the few other services automatically start up and prepare themselves just so that you can develop on that one microservice or that one container. And so I really like the depends on along with the Healthchecks feature. If you have questions on that, throw them in chat. I'm happy to show examples. Medium's asking about Python packages within an image. We're doing it by pip install during the build phase, but the wheel file needs to be within the Docker context of the app. Yes, I mean, in general, with all apps, if you have one Python app in your repo, then the Docker file, the Compose file, the Docker ignore file, and the pip requirements text file, those are all files that need to be in the root of the repo. That's the standard. And yes, any files that you need in the Docker file, inside of the Docker container when it's building the image, then you'll have to include those in the context. And so with the Docker file and the Docker command that you run all being run at the root of the project, that just works. So maybe Medium, let me know if there's a specific scenario that's not working. Because really it's just, you have a Docker file, from Python slim, always use the slims, Python, 3.11 -slim, and then you're going to copy in the requirements file, then you're going to pip install that requirements file. Or if you're using, a different dependency manager than pip, that's fine too. And then you're going to copy in the rest of your source, and then you're off to the races. So you do it in that order. That way, whenever your source files change, you don't break the cache. I explain that in my course. If you haven't taken the Docker Mastery course, I explain that cache breaking and how you want, in a lot of these languages, you want to first copy in the dependency management file, whether it's package.json, requirements text, gem file, whatever. You copy that in. You run the install for all those dependencies. Then you copy in the rest of the source, and then you do whatever you need with that source. So if that doesn't help, if that doesn't answer all your questions, let me know on another question. Hey, and thanks for becoming a member. I appreciate it. That's great. Yeah, and for those that haven't heard, if you're new and you weren't here at the beginning of the show, just like here on YouTube, you can subscribe as a member in multiple places. They all give you the same benefits. You only need to subscribe one place: YouTube, on my website, or on Patreon. And on my website, for example, it's easier to do this than to show you the memberships on YouTube. There's 2 different levels. And if you do it on my website, again, this is all the same, so it doesn't really matter where you do it. But on my website, you have a newsletter. Now, you don't get the newsletter with the YouTube sign up, but that's okay. Just jump over to my website, bret.news, bret.news, or just, wait, over there, bretfisher.com, way over there. That just takes you to my website, and you can sign up for the newsletter over here. And that's technically a free membership, is what that is. It's just the way that Ghost Engine works for blogging. And just like here on YouTube, if you sign up for one of the membership plans, you get certain benefits. But the High Fivers one is what gets you the exclusive monthly hangout with me and friends, where we all talk about DevOps. And it's just a bunch of DevOps professionals hanging out for lunch or whatever your time zone is. Maybe it's dinner, maybe it's late night, depending on where you live. And we do it once a month. We just had it yesterday, and it's a great little group. I really enjoy that group because I tend to learn stuff. Other people bring projects they're working on, new problems. We had one of the people yesterday bring in a scenario of trying to use dev containers with the new Compose Watch feature. And we talked about that for a while, on how that they're a little bit competing features, but also you might be able to use them together in interesting ways. And yeah, it's a good time. So thank you. Thanks for being a member. Stick around. Come back every Thursday. I'm here every Thursday. We have Normal coming on as co-host most of the time, just not this week. And then we have guests. Every other week we have a guest. We learn about a new project, a new tool, something new in DevOps and cloud native computing. And then this all turns into a podcast. Not every episode makes it into a podcast, but if you're interested in the podcast, you can also go over there to find the newsletter, the podcast, all the other things that come out of this. So thanks for showing up. Yes, Anton, but you can still do that with depends on. So in depends on, you can create a service healthy query in your Compose file that will query the database for a successful result. Maybe it needs to have been seeded, if that's the right way to say it. And you need to make sure that there's a specific user in the database before you consider the database healthy. So you can create a command and you can tell it how often to check the database container, and it will not spin up your app until that check passes. Let me see if I can find you an example of how that works. Over on my GitHub page, I have tons of examples, and so many, in fact, that I sometimes don't remember them all. Let's see if this has an example. So yes, here is an example. Let's see if I can blow that up a little bit. So in this Docker Compose file, you can see that the database has a health check file mounted into the database on startup, and it runs every 5 seconds this Postgres health check. And then my other services, my front end, has a depends on, but not just depends on DB, it depends on DB with a condition of service healthy. The condition by default is just set to container started. It's just that I'm not even sure the exact, your editor actually would tell you exactly what options you can put in here in the condition. But if you say service healthy, that means the health check has to pass. The health check has to pass. It's hard to say. And that health check can be anything. It can be any script. It can be a long script. So if I go over here and look at what the script is, let's see, what's the path in that? Health checks, Postgres health check. So if I go in my health checks directory and look at this file, it logs in. So it means that the user has to exist so that the query can start. And I do a select statement. And if there's not at least one row in the return, then it errors out. And so the only way the health check in this case can pass is if there's at least one record in the database for that select query in that database. So you can make this script whatever you want, right? It can be a simple command, just a simple ping of a port, but I like it to be more complex and to actually know that my database has the data in it. If you had a seed that you needed to run, if you didn't know, a lot of the database containers like Postgres, MySQL, Maria, all these different databases, they have a feature where if you pass a .SQL file into a certain directory, the container will automatically ingest those queries, that .SQL file, on startup. So you can have an automatic seed by just going in your compose file and mounting another volume that is your seed file into a specific directory. And on the first start, the database will ingest it. And then the health check will run every 5 seconds. A health check, by the way, in a Docker container is basically an exec command. It's like running a Docker exec in the container to run that script every 5 seconds. It's just doing that in the background. Now, Compose, unlike Swarm and Kubernetes, Compose is not going to react to that container if it fails. It's not going to restart the database. It's not going to kill the database. It's simply doing it so that my depends on is aware of the service. And when I run a Docker Compose command, specifically a Docker Compose PS, it will show me the status. Let's actually look at that. I will do this for you as an example. So over, let's see, let's go to VS Code. Actually, no, I'm going to do this in Warp. So let's go find that. So under code, let's see. Node.js rocks in Docker. So if you're curious about this repo, I will send you the link to this repo. This is a Node.js example, but this could work for Python or anything else. The fundamentals of Compose are the same, right? Regardless of the language you're writing in. But over here, if I look in this directory, I have my Compose file and I have the health checks. So if I do a Docker Compose up, it's going to spin up those containers. I'm doing a -D, so it'll do it in the background. And yep, so it's got to download some images. Build some stuff. It's building the Node app. So it's created the networks. And notice that it's created the DB. And see how it says healthy there? So it's waiting for that to be healthy before it started the node one. So it technically created the node container. It just didn't start it yet. And now if I do a Docker Compose PS, which gives me a list of, is that healthy? It does say healthy. It's not what I want. I'm still trying to get used to Warp Terminal. It's so weird to me. I've been trying to force myself to use Warp. If you haven't heard of Warp, it's a new style of terminal, has advanced functionality, but it doesn't behave the same way as my old terminals do. Oh, that's what it is. My Node app crashed. I'm not sure why it crashed. That's why it's not running, but you can see that the indication there is, if I zoom out a little bit, let's see if I can, it's kind of hard to read on screen. It's a little small, but you can see the status, and the status on the database is healthy. And the only way it knows that it's healthy is that the health check passed. And the only way that the health check passes is if there is a select statement that comes back with something. Yeah, so I do that on a lot of teams where they're using Compose for local dev. They're using it to start their app, and maybe they might have 20 services in their Compose file, and maybe they don't need them all. So they might just say Docker Compose up worker, right? Because they have a worker service. They call it worker, Docker Compose up worker, which would only start that service and any things it's dependent on. So those dependency chains help me start up a subset of the app, not the whole app, not the whole solution, I guess we should say. And that's very useful in a microservice architecture or just in a large enterprise-y production style setup, because you don't normally want everything. I believe it was Kelsey Hightower that said, if you make a microservice architecture solution that requires all the microservices to be running in order to develop on one, then all you've done is created a distributed monolith. It's a great statement. I've heard him say it multiple times, and it's absolutely true. Sorry, muted myself. I'm not necessarily saying we should all be doing microservices. I am not a automatic fan of everything microservice. I think it's the right thing for the right job. If you are in a simple setup and you can do everything in a single repo and a monolith, great. I know lots of very successful monolith apps. So it's just it's all about trading out pros and cons for other pros and cons, right? And so in my dev setup, I'm always trying to run the least amount of things I need in order to get the job done. I don't want to have to run everything, use all my memory up. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Anyone got anything else for me? Oh, Medium, let's see. What do you say? We have 10 plus services. They are reusing some modules from shared packages, which is installed via a pip install. This requires that all services share the same context. Okay. So in that case, maybe you're different. So the path it may be in a different directory and it's not a subdirectory. One of the things that's true about the Docker context is that it can't, the Docker file can't escape the context, right? Because technically, when you type a Docker build command, the first thing that happens is that the directory of the context, that dot we all like to put in the end in examples, it takes all that and tars it up and then sends it to the engine. And then everything is done with, and then that tarball is extracted and everything is done in that place inside the engine, because the engine might not be on your local machine. I mean, with Docker Desktop, it's in a VM, so it has to tarball up your local machine's current context, send it over to the engine, and the engine unpacks it and does everything it needs to build the container from there. So the Docker file can't escape the context in that case. So I don't know enough about your design to know what is the easiest way to solve that problem, but it's definitely solvable. It maybe would mean that you need to architect your application a little bit different. If these are packages that are installed via pip in order for one app to run, are they in different repos? Are they in subdirectories of the same repo? Could you install those from a repository, a Python package repository, rather than a path? And that obviously limits certain ways that you might want to debug or develop. But yeah, that's the kind of thing where it's a custom exploration of what you have today and what options are available to you. But I've done all this before with teams, and there is always a way through. There's always a way to make a manageable solution in containers. Docker files and Docker Compose and all these other tools are very flexible. The trick is to find the easiest thing without having to re-architect everything, right? So that's why people hire me. So I would say you might have to figure out a way to pull all those packages in. I mean, are they built? I'm sitting there trying to think of a package to a different path. This used to happen with a company that I worked with on gems. They had different gems, and those gems were custom gems that had different repos. And so they had a directory, and then all the repos were subdirectories. And essentially their build tooling for containers was in its own repo, and it would expect a specific folder structure on their local machine. So they might have like 6 repos checked out, and they all should be the names of the repos. And it would actually, before doing the Docker build, it would go and grab things from other directories at the same path. Yeah, and so it required some scripting. It required some stuff that maybe wasn't the simplest ideal solution. But if you're doing that kind of thing where you're bringing in dependencies, I mean, Git submodules is a thing. You can always use Git submodules if you wanted to try that approach. That way, everything's a subdirectory, and you can version things through submodules. It just kind of there's so many different ways. And this was a conversation we had yesterday, by the way, in our High Fivers group. We were talking about that. Sometimes I have to go to a development team and tell them that their application architecture may have to be tweaked or changed because they're trying to simplify their tooling. And so in the case of, I've seen systems where the developers kept bolting on new things over time, different repos, different solutions, pulling these custom packages from here. These packages are over there. These are through a file path to a different repository that has to be checked out to a specific version. They have all this different stuff. And sometimes we have to step back and look at the whole solution and say, in the modern world of cloud native, where everything's in a container and different containers do different things, and we maybe don't even bundle our app the same way we maybe did 10 years ago, we are going to have to start changing the way this application is laid out, the structure of the repos, the structure of the modules or the dependencies, in order to optimize for modern cloud native development. And that has been true of all development going back 50 years. Because over the decades, if you look at development and the style of programs we make, the style of tooling we use, even the languages themselves are often written and designed to solve the problems of the day. And so if you look back even just the last 30 years, 20 years, we have had times where compute was limited, compute was expensive, compute was slow. So we didn't want to optimize our builds, meaning we started making languages that would build at runtime and would only build the things we needed. And that wasn't because that was the best idea for all languages for all time. That was because we were optimizing the languages. Sometimes it's a framework like Node.js, not necessarily the language, but we optimize those languages for the limitations of the day. What you see now is we've got plenty of compute. Disk is relatively cheap. We've got, so much more data storage options than we did 30 years ago. So what you see today, unlike 30 years ago, is languages are on the rise, like Go and Rust. Obviously, there's lots of others. I'm just going to use those two as an example. Those two languages are gaining in massive popularity, especially in cloud native, because the way we deploy and run our artifacts is way different than we did 20 years ago. And the languages back then, we were maybe, if you'd asked me to build a server for you to run a PHP app in the year 2000, when I would change a file, I would only upload that changed file to the server, saving bandwidth, which was very limited. We were on dial-up a lot of times. We were saving disk storage changes, and the file I/O was a little bit slower because we had the spinning disks, and they were often very slow compared to to the SSDs we have today. And then compute was not great. So we were optimizing the language, the distribution model, everything for the limitations. Now we have much faster bandwidth, much faster CPUs, way more storage than we used to. So what you see is the new languages that are being written in the last decade or so are actually designing us to bundle all the dependencies into a single binary and then ship that rather large binary rather than the tiny source code. And you might look at that as a problem. Like you're shipping a gigantic Go binary that ships with SSL and everything else built in instead of reusing the libraries of a Linux host. That's because the problems of today aren't that we need to reuse all the libraries across all the different things we're running on a server in order to save disk space and be efficient. The big problem now is we want to shove more things on a single server in many different places, usually containers, and all those things will have different dependencies and we don't want them to clash. And the way to guarantee that is to put them in a container. And the easiest way to ship a container is to build a single file, shove it in an artifact, which is basically a tarball, store it in a registry, and then deploy it to a server. So a lot of teams, and this is why all the cloud native tooling is really built a lot of times in Go, it's a single binary including all dependencies, except for the Linux kernel. And so that is the way we're going, is a tooling and resource optimization, not because the programming language is the best language we've ever invented. And you will see this continue to change. Maybe next decade we'll have new limits. Maybe IoT will finally take over and we will invent new ways to build apps. Maybe WASM, which is a very exciting new technology, WebAssembly on cloud native, it takes this whole idea, it strips out all the dependencies because WASM itself can be the single binary runtime on a server, and then you ship out this tiny WASM file. It can be a single file if you want it to, but you can ship that in a container image. You save a lot of space because you don't need all those underlying dependencies again because those are all in the WASM runtime. And so that architecture is being experimented with. It's really early days, not recommended for most people in production yet, but we're experimenting with that because it optimizes at a different level. It's also very, very fast to run. So that's another thing, is it's super fast. And anyway, that's a soapbox moment for me. Sorry if I rambled, but the languages are a sign of the times of when they were created. And what I often end up working with on teams like Python and Ruby, .NET, stuff like that. These are all languages that are decades or more old, and they were trying to solve the problems of the day. And even though we have modern tooling for them, that tooling can only do so much. So there are going to be natural inefficiencies along the way because they're not optimized from the scratch, from the ground up, for the modern way we develop, ship, and run our applications. And that just creates complexity. So I end up, a lot of times with consultant clients, we end up redoing our architecture of our application to optimize for modern deployment methodologies. And that's not always the same thing. We don't always do the same thing One of those might be that you ultimately redesign the way your dependencies are used because it maybe makes your building really complicated. I don't know. I haven't looked at your stuff, so I'm not judging you. I'm not telling you what you're doing is wrong. But if you find that you just can't seem to solve this problem and it's a real problem, it may mean that there is an architecture change that has to happen somewhere else in the application. It's a great topic. Can a truck driver become a DevOps engineer? Seriously. I mean, there's nothing inherently unique about software development or DevOps engineering or any of that stuff that would preclude any particular person from not doing it. There are plenty of people that have started this career as a second career. I was lucky and got started in the 90s, so it was my career to start with. Obviously, I wasn't doing DevOps in the 90s, but I was in tech, fixing computers, writing programs, and have done that now for almost 30 years. But there are tons of people. That's why we have boot camps today. That's why we have all this online learning, is because people are either learning in university, learning after university, or learning way later in life as a second, maybe even third career. So sure, there's nothing keeping you from attempting to change your career. Obviously, everyone's got their own limited free time and their own challenges, and everyone has their own budget, their own experience level. There's just a lot of different factors that decide how you're going to learn and what you're going to do to change your career. But you can do it. It's all there for you. The wonderful thing about software is that it's right in your computer. So, and your computer, wherever your computer is where you can learn. So, to me, it's one of the careers that is maybe one of the more complicated careers, and there's a lot to it. There's a lot of different programs and tools and methodologies that you have to learn, and we don't have a very structured single way of learning. There is no universal DevOps certification that everyone is required to have in DevOps. And just like I was saying earlier, if you rewind and watch this show, we talked about DevOps jobs earlier and how there's lots of different DevOps jobs. So saying you want to be a DevOps engineer is no more specific than saying you want to be a software developer. There's so many different types of jobs in the world of DevOps that you don't even technically have to be a programmer. And you could find jobs just managing infrastructure, and they might be called a DevOps job. It just depends on what you want to do. I know people that are developers that ended up liking infrastructure and liking automation so much that they stopped being a full-time developer and moved more into managing infrastructure, creating servers, managing databases, running the networks, all that stuff. And then there are people that were doing that work and started writing their own programs and liked to be a software engineer. So they just shifted more into developing all day rather than managing infrastructure. So it just depends on what your interests are. I'd say go with where your interest lies. Try lots of things at first. Buy some courses on Udemy. I have Docker courses below, but I don't teach you DevOps from scratch. So you need to know servers, you need to know the cloud, and you need to know networking first. So if you're brand new to tech and you're watching me on a computer, go get a Linux course. Go learn Linux. That's the server operating system that runs the internet. So learn that. Make one locally on your machine at home so you can play with it. You'll learn all that in the courses. There's lots of free YouTube videos. There's lots of free courses out there for learning Linux. And that will help you learn a lot of things. You need to understand how the command line works. You need to know how operating systems function, at least at a basic level. And then you need to know how they communicate. Networking is very, very important because all of our devices are all communicating constantly, and they're all doing it the same way. They're all using the same packets of information, the same protocols. And so that's really, really important to learn early on. And then later, you can learn things like the cloud and programming and DevOps. So I if I am going to interview someone for DevOps, a lot of the questions are first going to be about the operating system, primarily Linux. It's going to be about networking, security, firewalls, stuff like that, and making sure that they have a strong fundamental understanding of how all this stuff works together. Because if you don't have that, learning the cloud is not going to help you a whole lot, because it'll look like magic. It'll look like everything just magically appears and happens and talks to each other. So you need to know those base fundamentals first. And if anyone else agrees or has resources or anything recommended, speak up in chat. It's a great question. What do I think about APM tools like Dynatrace? They're fine. You'll know if you need an APM, and you can pick one. I don't use them really, so I don't have a preference. I am not here to recommend any particular one, because that's not really my job role. But if you think you need one, and if you don't know that if you need it, then you don't need it. If you don't have a problem in performance, reliability, then a lot of teams don't buy a formal APM because they don't have a performance problem. They don't have a reliability problem. They don't need to debug production stuff. But if you know you do, then I'm sure there's a lot of good ones out there. There's probably free ones. There's paid ones. But I'm not that person to be the expert for you. So good luck. Let me know what you decide. All right, Medium's got one more question. Last question. Sure, it's your last question. You can ask all the questions, but I have to quit soon, so we've only got maybe 15 minutes left. Okay. We are contemplating on using Spark with AKS as opposed to running it on Synapse for huge-scale geospatial imagery processing. We are afraid of maintenance overhead. Any comments? Never used it, so I am not going to have good comments. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, if you're afraid of maintenance overhead, your spidey sense is probably working. As opposed to running it on Synapse. Yeah, I don't really know. AKS, like any Kubernetes, I always advise if you're going to use Kubernetes, you use it the highest abstraction level possible. So ideally, you want the cloud to manage everything they can about Kubernetes. You want to pay the cloud to run as much of your Kubernetes for you as possible. On AWS, that's Fargate, where they manage the nodes, so you don't even have to update the nodes. You don't need to SSH into anything. They manage all that for you. And that's the best way to run Kubernetes, especially if you don't have multiple full-time Kubernetes experts. You don't want to have to run Kubernetes yourself. And if you're just going to run Kubernetes yourself, even in a data center, you're going to need multiple people that know Kubernetes and are wanting to manage Kubernetes clusters and Kubernetes upgrades 3 times a year, and all of the dependency services like proxies, data storage, backups, monitoring, logging, all the things that come along with running your own Kubernetes. This is essentially like when you decide to run your own Kubernetes, if you're going to do something like AKS or EKS or GKE, if you don't opt for the higher level concierge service where they run the nodes for you, they make it easier for you to maintain, then you are essentially, it's like running your own mini data center inside the cloud, because you're basically saying we're going to start managing nodes. We're going to have to security patch those nodes. We're going to have to upgrade versions on those nodes. And then everything you want to run on top of it, you need to make sure that those are automatically maintained. This is why, for example, on Azure, since you're AKS, on Azure, there is what is it called? Azure Container Services. I always forget the name. Which allows you to just run containers without having to worry about the underlying Kubernetes cluster. On AWS, it's called App Runner. On GKE, it's called Google Cloud Run. And these are all higher level abstractions that may or may not be running Kubernetes underneath, but they are removing the burden from you of having to maintain the cluster by allowing you to have all the benefits. And of course, it costs a little more, but it's cheaper than hiring 3 Kubernetes engineers. That's for sure. Again, remember that Kubernetes itself was designed as a solution for private data center operators to maintain a large container infrastructure. It wasn't meant for one person part-time to run in addition to all the other infrastructure in the cloud. The advantage of the cloud is that you can outsource a lot of the infrastructure management to them. So I always encourage doing that because while it may be expensive, it is easier and cheaper in a lot of cases than hiring staff to manage it for you. And I think a lot of people, when it comes to anything Kubernetes, they underestimate the amount of work it takes over time to keep that system maintained. And it's getting a little easier to manage Kubernetes. We have one less release of Kubernetes a year. The upgrades are usually uneventful, but not always. And I don't know anything about whether Spark or Synapse, I don't know if Spark can run outside of AKS or if you can get a managed AKS for Spark. But if you can, go for that. If you're already worried about the maintenance, find a way to avoid the maintenance by letting the cloud manage it for you. Yeah. You want the flexibility and customization K8s provides? Well, then you have to be willing to take on the maintenance and be knowledgeable about Kubernetes. So I don't know. There is not a wrong decision here. It's simply a choice. And I just want you to go into that choice eyes wide open. It sounds like you are, that you are aware of what it's going to take. And Kubernetes is one of those things that's very powerful, but with great power comes great responsibility. So my preference, being someone who knows Kubernetes, my preference is to do those things with Kubernetes where I at least don't have to maintain the nodes, because most people don't do that well. Most people do not do monthly patching or node replacement, which is even better. Replace the node with a brand new version that has got everything up to date, including all system packages. It has everything. And then the latest Kubernetes version that matches your infrastructure is on there. That's what I want. I want all my Kubernetes clusters to be on the same version. I want to do a rolling upgrade style 3 times a year. That's going to require maintaining all the other things on top of it, not including your apps, but like the logging, the monitoring, the proxies, the certificate managers, like everything, the network policy stuff for controlling network policy around, like all these things have versions. And I've watched small teams or even individuals wanting to take advantage of Kubernetes, but not fully understanding that they're now being a sysadmin and that they have to maintain those servers. And then they come to me in 2 years and they're like, my Kubernetes cluster is now out of warranty. It's out of service. So it's really old version. And in order for me to upgrade Kubernetes, it's telling me I need to upgrade this other thing first because that thing requires a dependency of Kubernetes version blah. So I have to upgrade all my nodes for this monitoring agent before I can upgrade Kubernetes itself. And I have to have all these shell scripts, and I don't know how to do all that. So if you're comfortable with that, cool, do it. If you're not, that's the world of managing a Kubernetes cluster if you have to manage the nodes. This happened on AWS, by the way, with AKS, or EKS. That you have all these other things that are tied into Kubernetes that aren't the core of Kubernetes, but they're necessary services, and they're going to have dependencies. So you're going to have to upgrade things in a certain order, and you're going to have to do it multiple times a year. So just plan for that. Make sure you have the time available and that you like doing it, because you're going to have to do it a lot. And if you're okay with that, then Go on a campaign to prove to your management that you like it and that you are able to do it. And maybe you'll win. Maybe they'll give you a trial project. So, is serverless a bad idea? No. It's just another tool. Serverless is great when you don't want to and don't need to manage servers. And like every other option on the cloud for how to run applications, there are times for using Lambda. There are times for using ECS. There are times for using EKS. It's just a choice. And even the clouds themselves change their design of how they run their own applications and figure out that there's more efficient ways to do things. So I think it's very dependent upon the team, their expertise, how many people you have to do this work, what kind of applications you're building. There's a lot to go into that decision. And so that's why people hire consultants sometimes. They hire someone or they hire a new engineer on their team that has that experience so that maybe they'll have someone to advise them when they're considering something like serverless. Yeah. But obviously, there is not one thing that works well for everyone. So just because one person uses serverless well doesn't mean another team will benefit from it. Pretty soon, though, by the way, this show is live every Thursday. And we are actually having an AWS Serverless Hero on the show. When is that going to be? So on September 7th, a couple of weeks from now, we're going to have Ken Collins on the show to talk about Lambda and running containers in Lambda. And he's an AWS Serverless Hero. And we're going to talk about it. So come back every week. If you didn't know, you can get on the newsletter, Bret.news. And the newsletter will keep you posted on who's going to be on the show and what's coming up. Yeah, go check out that Bret.news. That's a free newsletter every week, one a week. And it'll let you know what we just had, what we released on the podcast, what was on the live show, when to come back for Q&A. Not every week is this format of Q&A, so you have to check. And you can kind of figure that out if you just go back. If I go to my channel, and you can see the past live streams here, you can kind of see a pattern where every other week is a guest, and then the alternating weeks are Q&A episodes. Sometimes it's just me. Sometimes my friend Nirmal co-hosts with me, and we answer questions together. And then we, every other week, we will have a guest. So come back on Thursdays. You can watch the live shows after the fact here on YouTube. And then a lot of them with our guests, we will turn into the podcast, which you can also find in your podcast player. Just look up Bret Fisher or look up Docker and DevOps, and you'll find us. All right, everyone. I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much for joining me for this stream. I hope I answered your questions all. If I forgot, it wasn't intentional. If I didn't see your question, that wasn't intentional. I may have missed. Thanks, Medium, for becoming a member. I really appreciate it. And we will be back next week talking about preview environments with Ufizzy. We'll be talking about creating ephemeral environments automatically with your PRs, with your epics, whenever you need them. And then after that, in a couple of weeks, we'll have the Lambda thing. We're going to talk with Ken about that. And then we're going to have Multipass on the show to talk about making easy Linux VMs on your local machine. Multipass is a great tool for that. And we're going to have Chris from the engineering team at Canonical that makes Multipass. Going to be on the show to talk about it. And then I got DockerCon and KubeCon after that. So if you're going to be at one of those conferences, you can actually go to my website, bretfisher.com/findme. If you're going to go to any of the conferences, I keep a list on my website of all the conferences I've been at, all the videos that I make when I speak at conferences, and what are my future conferences. So later this year, I will be at DockerCon in LA and then at KubeCon in Chicago. So if you're going to be there, let me know. Come hang out in the Discord right here, devops.fan. We're there all day, all night. And come hang out, chat with us. And and you can show up. And we have actually a conference channel, which whenever we have conferences, if one of us is going to be at a conference, we're trying to organize so that others from this growing DevOps community, 15,000 people, we try to make the little meetups happen in all the different conferences. So if you're going to be at a conference, then join in there and see if anyone else is in your area. And hopefully we'll all meet each other in the real world. Thanks again, everyone. I will be back live next week. Until then, jump on the newsletter and jump into the Discord server. I'll see you then. Ciao.